Hey everybody, how are you doing? This is Bryan Kramer. We are back for another H2H chat, and that means that it's Monday at noon Pacific Standard Time, or a different time somewhere else in the world. And I am so excited to be here today with another Bryan, who spells his name with a Y. So this is going to be awesome. Before I make a proper introduction to Bryan and explain who he is, if you don't already know, and what he does, I wanted to do a quick shout out to and have a quick hello with Suzie. Suzie, how are you doing?
I am doing very well. Spring has sprung here on the East Coast, and it is a very welcome relief. So I'm happy. I'm good. How are you doing?
You seem content.
I'm content. You look very relaxed after a week in Hawaii.
I am definitely more relaxed than when I left, but
There you
it's
go.
funny how quickly you unrelax when you
Yes.
get
Yeah,
back.
I always try to gauge it and almost be like, okay, please tell me that, if I feel like I'm in the positive side and not like the negative, then I consider my vacation a success.
There you go. Glass is half full. I
There you
love
go, exactly.
it. Well, good. We are very excited to be joined by both a friend of mine and also a just an awesome business professional who is building some really great things, and we're going to get into what those things are. But I'm going to make a much more formal intro, and then we'll have Bryan kind of tell you a little bit more about himself. So Bryan grew up in Minnesota, of all places.
Yay, don't you know?
What's that?
Yay, don't you know? Vikings and
That came way too easily.
soda
I
pop.
love it.
He moved out to California when he accepted into Stanford University, and not only did Bryan make it out of Stanford with a degree in product design, but the university eventually asked him back to teach in the product design department. Besides teaching at Stanford for 10 years, Bryan worked as a toy designer in the early days of his career, designing toys for Skyline Toys, which IDEO eventually bought out. And IDEO is one of the design firms to follow that I also follow. So nice work there. After leaving the playful world of toy design, Bryan started 3 businesses, including Zurb in 1998. For the last 2 decades, Bryan's advised over 300 successful startups and companies who have created billions of dollars and touched hundreds of millions of customers, hopefully appropriately touched them. His unique approach to design thinking has spawned software like Zurb's Foundation and Notables, used by millions of designers and inspired companies to embrace Zurb's progressive design. So Bryan, welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm good. I'm nursing a cold, so if you hear sniffles, I apologize. I wanted to make sure I was on and excited to talk with you.
Well, glad you're able to be here, and we won't make it too tough for you since it's a little bit more challenging for you today. But you know this stuff like the back of your hand, so I know this is going to be smooth sailing for you. But before we begin, I want to dive into some of the things that I just talked about in the introduction. I was wondering if you could just give kind of a short idea as to just your own thinking as we talk about design. How do you think about design? What is design to you?
Well, I think if you look at my career, I started at Stanford learning about product design from physical products. And so I learned a lot about problem solving and understanding how to look at problems sort of holistically, not just at the tail end of a production cycle, but looking at it from a strategic perspective as well. So my initial understanding of design, I was kind of thrown into something in a very broad perspective. And so I look at design as basically the rendering of intent. Is if you looked at it from a very broad perspective, there are problems and there are solutions, and design can work in both spaces. And so what we have done over the course of 2 decades is figure out how do you do that in a digital environment? How do you help people solve these tough challenges and problems and figure out what the actual problems are? And design is a great place to be able to solve these challenges.
So let's dive in. I mean, you helped to design toys, and how do you apply that what you're doing now. And now you're looking at more digital. Is that right?
Yeah. So when I got my first job, I worked as an intern. And just fell in love with the process of creating things. The company I work with was Skyline Toys, and that process of coming up with ideas and trying to sell concepts and ideas was really new to me because I'd never understood that you could come up with an idea, license it, and then make money off of it. And so probably a weird first job to have because it probably distorted my view of what reality is and how things get made. But it was an incredible opportunity to work with a talented group of people. And so what we would do is basically toy companies would come to us with all kinds of ideas of areas that they needed in the marketplace. And what we do is come up with a bunch of concepts and ideas, and we'd prototype out these concepts and ideas to put them into a place where people could understand what it was. And at the time, there was a lot more digital products being built, so a lot of this was like figuring out how to take a very complex ideas and make it into something very simple. So we would do all kinds of video work to demonstrate a concept. I did a lot of sketching, trying to understand how to present a concept or idea. We hacked together prototypes, and it was an incredible experience. And you know, I got to be part of probably about 40 toys that got licensed, and you know, and you probably know this. Licensing an idea doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to go to market. And I was probably about 10. I got to be participating in about 10 products that went to market. And that model was really interesting to me. But it taught me a lot. It taught me a lot about understanding how important the idea and concept selling is, not just the actual product. Because if someone couldn't get the concept from the get-go, then it would never sort of mature into something that would be a product that people would want to buy. So there's lots of people that needed to be influenced in this whole sort of supply chain of from the product groups to the person doing the acquisition of the invention ideas to sort of the manufacturing arm to like even the outsourced partners in China. And I realized how complex this was to bring a product to market. What I was fascinated in was the idea that you could take this concept and it could turn into something that millions of people could use. So I got that bug very early on in my career. And fortunately, the web was just emerging. I was like, wow, this is like on steroids doing the same thing, as you could put an idea in the world and it could touch a lot of people very quickly.
Sorry, I muted myself so I didn't cough in your ear.
Yeah.
So as you started to build, let's get into Zurb a little bit and talk about Zurb and what Zurb is and how do you look at design differently now, given what you just talked about. You took everything that you learned from building these great toys and seeing the entire process all the way through, in most cases, and in some cases learn some of the challenges and the uphill battles. How now do you see the world differently at Zurb because of this great experience you had?
Well, I think there's a lot of great products, and physical products are amazing. There's sort of this visceral reaction you get when you use it. If you have step in a car and you have the steering wheel and all these parts are amazing. And when I first started, it was very much about the parts, about the things, about what needs to be crafted. And as I've progressed over my career over the last 2 decades, what I've realized is a lot of that is really the easy part, the crafting materials, sourcing materials, and manufacturing. The hard part is trying to create an outcome or a desired outcome that either the business wants, the user wants, or within the constraints of whatever technology you have. And that has really become sort of my life's work now, is how do you design for influence? How do you create outcomes that are extremely positive for both the people creating it, the companies, and people consuming the products and services? That is less about designing for an artifact and more about understanding how to drive an outcome. And that requires a whole different skill set than learning just how to work in a computer, Photoshop, Sketch, wireframing. It's really about understanding the psychology of people.
So walk me through it. What is there? Is it the same process every time? Is it a linear process, or is it a non-linear process?
It's a non-linear process, and this is, you introduced a little bit of what we are producing, which is progressive design as a design system for people to be able to do this. What really you start to see is patterns in human behaviors, right? And when you work with a team, maybe you go to work every day, there's a certain set pattern that's established. And when you're building something great or trying to break sort of the norm, or you're trying to create something that's exceptional, typically you have to dismantle those sort of engagements or the way that you interact with the people around you. And that is really hard because that creates all kinds of angst and anxieties. It creates potential for failures to happen, misalignment of goals, all kinds of things that happen from just working with other people. And so what we have sort of figured out by doing this enough times is there's certain cycles and behaviors that you can repeat, and others where they need to be challenged. And some of it is just knowing that you're in a safe place where you can actually work with teammates in a way that creates the outcome you're shooting for. So just to give you an example. So you might have been working with a team for a couple of years working on maintenance of an existing product. And maybe the strategy group comes in and says, guys, we have dwindling sales for the last 2 years. We need something new, right? And this team has been formulated with the idea that it's maintaining a consistent base of revenue and has created either products that aren't creating much error or problems, and so they're very set in their ways. And so now to create this new spark, you need either a leader to take initiative that's going to break up the status quo, or find someone else that's on the outside to bring in to break up some of the existing process that's probably in place. A lot of businesses might use another group or try and farm that out to an incubator or try and bring in a consulting firm. These are all strategies that work, but ultimately the team that owns these problems needs to be able to psychologically deal with the fact that moving into new territory is very angst-filled. It's filled with lots of failure because trying to get to new products and services isn't always easy. So in that regard, it isn't a very linear process when you first start up, because you're opening problems up and trying to dismantle perhaps processes that are prohibiting growth. As you get to a problem space where you have solutions in mind that you can get to, it starts to become much more of a critical thinking path, a very linear path. But that initial sort of opening up problems and discovery of new ideas, that can be a bumpy ride for a lot of people. And that's what we're trying to help people figure out, is how do you create a more linear pathway in that sort of bumpy ride so that the confidence in the team members that you have is being built in a positive way and not a destructive way where, you know, lots of failure is happening to get those new results.
So what do you think is when somebody is going to look at helping, whether it's a client, a product, or anything within the design process, what do you think is the most critical piece?
I would say empathy and understanding that not everything is going to go the way you want. And when you can understand that from the get-go, it makes it a heck of a lot easier to dive into the unknown. There's a lot of research that's been done, and this is something we focus on, is affectional reasoning versus causal reasoning. Empathy is a great place to start with, understanding that you can't necessarily change everything around you to get to a desired result. If the result is fixed and you're trying to do that, it can be very unpleasant. And so when trying to create outcomes that may not be fixed, where there is some kind of visualization of success, you have to work within the means around you. And the means are either capital, time, people. And when you empathize with all of those situations which you kind of put in, it makes it a heck of a lot easier to start seeing a forward path where you can understand how you might be able to change those ingredients to create a better outcome.
Yeah, that's a good point. How do you? So okay, let's dive in even deeper. How do you create a place of empathy? How do you? What would the formula be for helping people to have empathy? I mean, that's such a human trait, which I should warn you that anytime you say human, this happens. I forgot to tell you beforehand. And you did say human before. I just didn't want to scare the crap out of you, so I didn't do it.
Yeah, no, you're good. We're good.
But moving forward, if you say human, that's going to happen. So, what would you say is the best way to help create an environment of empathy? If empathy is the most critical step, how do you create an environment to do that?
Right. So if you looked at our business, the way we try and do this happens in lots of different facets of it. So the first is creating a learning environment. And so if we understand that our job is to learn every day, learning is fraught with sort of struggles, right? Because we're trying to overcome. And if that's everyone's job here, then there's no one that is purely an expert in anything. We're always trying to figure something out. And so it becomes much easier to empathize with people when you know that they're also on this journey to learn and figure out what the problem might be. There are mentors and there are coaches in our business that are going to be, have expert knowledge in something like a professor. But, I think of it more as like college, where the professor should be enlightened by the students as much as the teacher is trying to help the people around them. So when we have that shared ownership of learning and trying to figure out problems, it becomes much easier to empathize with the people around you. I think the second is observation, is being willing to sit back and observe. Oftentimes that's not a trait that's but in a business environment, typically people are like, yeah, sit back and observe. I want you to be successful at observing. But it does really open up a lot of problems when we're able to sit back and try and observe things. And that could be your customer, that could be how your stakeholders are making decisions, that could be how the table is structured and how people are talking at the table. So taking into account all these inputs is incredibly important to understanding how to empathize with the situation, the people, the circumstances, the means. And if we can do that, it makes it much easier to start finding solutions with people.
So I want to get into now the present day, where we're at, especially in your business of designing digital experiences, and then we'll talk about the future, and then we'll jump into questions. So anyone out there that has questions for Bryan, if you haven't started posing them already, and you're new to the group, use hashtag H2H and throw your questions out. Susie's going to be taking those questions for the second half of this and posing those back to Bryan. So definitely make sure you get your questions out. So Bryan, let's talk about present day. The digital world is way more complicated in my eyes. I'd love to hear your thinking, because it's not a physical product and you're done. It's always growing. There is no end to the world that we live in design. I mean, there's no closure really to anything that we have. So how do you design? What's the ending point to putting a product up?
Right. So before maybe looking at the endpoint, let's identify maybe 3 things that will prohibit growth from happening in a product or working with a team to create a successful outcome with digital products right now. The first is they're always on. So if your team hasn't developed a process to be able to address an always on product, then you're already falling behind. And so, I mean, Bryan, you almost stay up 24 hours a day working. I see you all the time, everywhere. You couldn't even do it 23 hours a day. So how do you work with teams to create outputs that are continually changing with the variability of the product? So let me give you an example, is that Amazon pushes to their server every 11 seconds, right? And you could say, well, that's code bits, they're fixing things. Well, if the average visit to Amazon is 10 minutes based on Alexa, you're looking at over 50 changes in one visit to the product itself, the digital environment that you're in. That doesn't necessarily even include the personalization or the customization of the product as you're using it. So in an environment where it's serving millions of people and adjusting on the fly in real time, the problems that you're solving from a product perspective are no longer just what does the button look like. It's where does the button morph to, and in what environment, and in what context, and why should it be red versus green in this context, and it becomes infinitely more complex. So the problems we're solving are systemic and system-oriented, as opposed to here's this widget, or here's this piece of text, or here's this content. So that's the first thing, is that the product is constantly in fluctuation. The second is that if you look at products like Facebook and Twitter, the customer is part of the product. There is no separation between those two. And so when you can build a product and solicit feedback, say from your teammate, or do market research, you already have research going on while the product is live. So data and collecting that data and even qualitatively talking to people and figuring it out changes the whole dynamic of your design process if you can solicit feedback 100% of the time, all of the time, as your product exists. So there has to be clear ways to try and figure out how do you take these inputs to make your product better. And the third area is the team psychology. It is no longer about just a production schedule or an industrial revolution idea of trying to create widgets in a factory line. You now have to psychologically deal with the inconsistencies of the human brain, because these problems are knowledge-based, and knowledge workers cannot work like a machine. They have emotions, they have variabilities, and that isn't something you're going to be able to cram into a pure production cycle. So now you have this variable of humans are messy, dealing with a product that is always on, that can get feedback from all places, right? And so this is the new design challenge that teams are going to have to solve for. And it's a pretty exciting time to be able to do this, and design has an opportunity to be at the front table trying to lead a lot of these changes. The gaps are, though, there's not enough people that are able to do all these things. So
that's so okay. Let's talk about a little bit, because we've got here 9 minutes before we jump into some questions. Let's talk a little bit about now, how do you design in collaboration? We've talked through a little bit of collaboration, but I'd like to focus on it just a little bit more. And I know that's something that you've even come to my company and talked to about how to collaborate. And unfortunately, I wasn't there to hear it. I was totally bummed, and so now I get my chance. So here goes. How do you create? What do you believe is the best process for creating a collaborative environment?
So collaboration on a day-to-day basis is actually fairly simple, and we have, in a design environment, brought that down to 4 actions that are pretty critical to the design process. And design can be used to facilitate conversations and drive agendas. So these are the things that we found. Is there's a creation process that needs to happen. So creative work requires that you do some sort of work. Usually that's not a conversation, that's producing some artifact. And while I said artifacts aren't that important in the end outcome, they are important to furthering the conversation. So creation of something is important. Most designers, if you talk to them, probably think that is the job that they're supposed to do. That's just the first part of their job, and I think this is where you're going to see design really take on a more collaborative role in environments, and this is where they have to spend their time. The second part of this, which is incredibly important, is showing that work. And showing that work isn't just putting work out in front of someone and saying, what do you think? It's walking them through and guiding them through a process of decision-making based on their reaction. And we have a phrase here that we use, tell me, show me, tell me what you showed me. And everything happens in 3s. And when we understand that if I set up a problem, I say, hey, I'm going to show you this thing on Tuesday, and I give you access to it. And on Tuesday, I actually show you it and walk you through it. And then I give you the takeaways that I heard from it. You are now facilitating and influencing the outcome. You're not just producing work. And so that's the second part of this equation, is that you have to be able to show the work. The third is you have to facilitate reactions. And reactions are really tough because it means that you have to get to the human element. Human? Okay, good. Yeah, how are you? You have to get to the heart of why someone might have a reaction. It may not be factual, it might be an emotion. And emotions are incredibly important in design because they carry people through actions, they inspire people, they make people happy. It's not just a mechanical thing. So reactions, when you're soliciting feedback, is incredibly important. And we can do that in multiple different venues, multiple different settings. So within your team, you can solicit feedback from your team. From stakeholders or groups like engineering group, we might be able to set up and collect feedback from those groups. We can set up and collect feedback from our customers because it's very easy to do that. We can even target demographics and be able to collect feedback from them. So we now have this whole new space to work in as a designer to be able to collect all these inputs in a way that before maybe it was just showing our boss our work. The last part is synthesizing this. This is where design really sings, is designers are trained to be able to synthesize ideas. They take complex components of something and bring it into a solution, and that's where if we listen and we're really good at the reactions and soliciting these inputs, we can take all those ideas and we can start to shape a better output. And if you do this enough times in a typical project where we will work over 10 weeks, we might do this 20 to 30 times over a project. And when you do this enough times, you start to get really, really good at understanding how to work with people and getting the right types of information from them.
Oh, that's excellent. And I love the tell me, show me, tell me what you showed me. That is usually, missed at either the first or the second step. I don't know if it gets.
It's hard. It's really hard. Yeah, it's hard, and sometimes we let the work itself want to solve the problem, and that's just not how great design happens. There's still a sales process, and there's still an identification of what was heard and listening, and that is important in design.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so what about software in terms of collaboration? I mean, you're talking about the people process, which is probably one of the most important things. But now we have collaborative software, and I think you may even have your own software that I might just be throwing you a softball here, but if I remember right from one of the conversations we had, you said that you had collaborative software. How needed is collaboration software to do what you were talking about?
Well, there's lots of ways that you can collect software. Yeah, I collect software like rabbit feet. They're all over the place, those softwares. The software required to do these types of techniques can vary. Quite frankly, design, more so than any other discipline, has methods that are wide-ranging. The amount of methods that I might use on a regular basis might be up to 100. Which is going to be very different than a lot of industries. And so the software has to be somewhat variable in that regard because you're going to be using different techniques. So, like SurveyMonkey. I use SurveyMonkey as a tool. It helps collect information from our customers if we need it. Our own tool, Notable, is where we do most of our design work as a collaboration platform for design because it gives us a single place to go tell our stories, to show in part, and then be able to post the work and solicit it in context and using annotations and figuring out how to use code as part of that. But we also use Google Docs a lot. Google Docs is a great shared collaboration space because you can write stuff. We use, for task management, we use Asana. Asana is a tool. It's a list generator. It's great for just knocking out more production-oriented items. It's not as great for I'd say sort of roadmap planning, but it's good for task management. Mm-hmm. Roadmaps, we just use spreadsheets. The Google spreadsheets oftentimes work really well for that. We use a lot of sketching too, so we'll put that in Notable to convey a lot of ideas in a visual format so that they're not stuck in a digital format that is really kind of restrictive. So. What else do we use? Obviously we have Foundation, which is an open source framework for coding responsive websites, and that is also good for emails and applications. And you're going to use your software of choice, Sublime, Coda, whatnot. So, we have a ton of tools that we're constantly using on a regular basis, but I wouldn't say that the tools always are the most important part. I'd say it's finding alignment in the process or the methods that you're going to be using with your team.
Yeah, that's certainly the theme that I'm hearing, not just from you but from others. And now that I just heard that from you, it makes way more sense that you need to let the team use what makes sense to them in any given project because no project is the same. We use a smaller list of what you just said, and yet we're always trying to find that magical combination because there's not just one piece of software out there that does it all. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Most software there's a compromise at some point. Obviously, if it was we actually build a lot of our own software too for our internal tools. If we feel like we want the solution to be exactly what we want, we'll put the time into it. But if it's available and it's readily out there, then we'll try and use someone else's software. We're big proponents of open source. We put a lot of code out there, so we share what we have, and Fortunately, lots of people do amazing things out there that we can use in our own workflows as well. So, you know, on the product building side, you know, there's a lot more just custom code you can use and reuse for your own purposes. On the sort of user end side of software, sometimes it's a little more regulated in that sense because there is a publisher and there's someone that has to produce the code. So.
Cool. Well, okay. So my last question before we start jumping into questions here, I'm just going to take just a couple more minutes, Suzie, of your time here before we jump in, is the future. I want to make sure that we kind of touch upon where you think things are heading, how it's different, how it's going to be different in the future. And we don't have to go that far out. We can just go a couple years, because you know we know that nobody has really the crystal ball. But where are things heading, and how will it become maybe more challenging or even easier in the next few years within the design field?
Right. So right now, design is broken. You know, if we just look at it, the current needs in the market are not being met by the potential of what design can offer it, and part of that potential is dependent on the right types of talent to do this. And so if you look at these problems coming up, just we're not prepared. We don't have the manpower to necessarily solve these problems. And so what I think you're going to see is a lot more environments and cultures and companies that understand that to get really good at this, it has to be baked into the overall process and methodologies of the companies. They're not going to be able to separate the two. You're not going to just be able to, you know, lop someone off the street that has skills and throw them into your environment and be able to just start executing on design. It requires a lot more collaboration, understanding systems, understanding kind of the complexities of the business, the market, the ecosystems. And I think that, you know, is going to be an interesting time for us as designers to solve these particular problems. And it means that, you know, we're going to get a seat at the table and making big design or big business decisions. But it also means we're going to make a lot of failures. We're going to cause a lot of problems. There's going to be a lot of friction. So I would imagine the next, you know, 5 to 10 years is going to be about sorting that out. You know, design as a profession is about 100 years old. You know, obviously we've been doing it for, you know, ever since man existed building tools, but as a professional sort of group, it was turn of the century, 20th century is when it started formalizing. And I think this new phase of design is going to take a while to kind of find a sweet spot where people are actually feeling good in companies, designers are feeling their sweet spots, and there's sort of the productivity you would expect out of people that are having to make bigger decisions for the business.
Great. Well, I could keep going, but unfortunately I've run out of time on my end, and so I may pop back in here with some questions of my own on the second half, but you're in good hands, and I'm going to pass the baton over to Suzie and to the community. I see there's lots of great questions coming in. Keep the questions coming, because even if we don't address them or get to them, we will make sure that they get answered. So hashtag H2H chat, pose your question over, and I'll take over on the Twitters while Suzie takes over on the conversation. Cheers, Bryan. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. Suzie, you're on mute. Whoop, whoop.
I'm unmuted. We are getting lots and lots of questions coming in. The conversation is really heated up, so thank you so much. For those of you in the Twitter stream, please take a moment to tweet in your questions using hashtag H2H chat. As Bryan said, we'll shoot through as many as we can on the air, and if not, I know the other Bryan has said that he's definitely interested in checking out the stream to answer questions there. So we're going to see how many we can get through this, kind of lightning round style. I'm going to go ahead and kick us off with a great question from our buddy Alan. Alan, thank you so much for joining us today. He says, how do you maintain the integrity of the design process under the pressure and pace of rapid development and deployment?
You know, I think this is a great question, because I don't think as an industry, as a group, we've totally got this figured out. What I've tried to do in our work and in the work that we're publishing for people to use is trying to find how to regulate it, because ultimately when you create something, there is it's wrought with failure. So an example is, I always use the Babe Ruth story as an example, is Babe Ruth hit 341, and he was considered one of the all-time best hitters. If you think about that, 341 for non-baseball people, that means that he missed 2/3 of the time, and he was celebrated as one of the best hitters of all time. He had a sensationalism about him where he was able to hit home runs and create amazing results, but the reality is he was losing most of the time. And so in order to create continuity in the workflow and be able to drive a process forward, people need to understand that you are failing most of the time in design. That is part of the process of design. And so when people sit at a table and they're criticizing something, they need to realize that that criticism is the process. It is part of what we need to do as a group. And so when we're able to empathize and understand that that's how design works, it becomes much easier to reconcile sort of the frustrations that come with it feeling like it's in the wrong direction or not everyone's on the same page. And I think when you create those systems where you create the regularity and how you produce, you have to take into consideration sort of that mental angst that comes along with creating great products. I think you're on mute again.
I know. Sorry. So then there's a follow-up question, actually, to Alan's question. So I think I'm going to go ahead and put this together. He adds to this. So we talked about integrity of the design process. He says, how does this then play into brand consistency? So, for example, the doing color for performance versus a specific brand's palette. How do you balance those?
So I think in any organization, I typically can look at their website and product and understand how decisions are made, right? It might be more technical, might be product-oriented, might be marketing, might be C-level driven. You can always look at these things and determine where the business is coming from. And I think you can't change a business's DNA very quickly. So if you're looking to take a highly technical company that has a brand and says, this is the color it is and this is why we believe that, that's not an easy thing to change. You can't just change the culture and the DNA to support a new way of thinking about getting to that answer. It takes time, and it takes a leader able to break down those barriers to try and open up problems where people are willing to look at a problem from a different perspective. So that link color example is a great example. Doug Bowman, I think, who was the creative director, I think, at Twitter, and he was at Google for a short stint where he was having to fight people over the 41 shades of blue. He put up a good fight, I think, to change that culture, but from a design perspective, he may not have been able to actually crack the nut. But we can all see now that Google's made fairly big strides as far as design's concerned, and it has taken 10 years to get to that place with executive buy-in. So a design process can't always solve those particular problems. You have to have C-level buy-in to the understanding of where you want to go with a different outcome. And if the business says, well, we need to be more data-driven, then that's going to take some time to get into the design process. If the the C-suites are saying, well, their brand is really suffering, we need to capture the human component of this, we need to change, that's going to take a while to kind of get through the system as well. So my suggestion is that you have a long view of some of these activities, because expecting someone to change the way they view color is a hard battle. It's not something you just win by a meeting or a committee.
So Ralph has an interesting question here. He wants to know, is your preferred design approach form follows function or function follows form? Lloyd Wright or Le Corbusier? It's been forever since I've taken French.
I probably would have 2 decades. I definitely would have been form follows function. And I think as I've moved in my career and understanding sort of how gray space and gray matter works with teams, there's an emotional component that comes into play that sometimes is the catalyst that creates momentum in a project. And so what I tend to want to do when I work on projects is get a feel of who's on that project, who's playing this game, who are the players that have a stake in the outcome, and try and look at it from a different perspective. And I think sometimes it's appropriate to to change. And I would still say that most of the time I'm a form follows function type of guy, but I would say that that's not something I hold myself to all the time. I think it's important to be open-minded about certain types of projects that might require a better understanding of sort of the emotional component of a project.
So then, follow-up question on my own. Do you think, obviously you've been in this space since '98, or before that, right? Yep. But specifically, you know, with your company, as technology has evolved, do you think that that's had any impact on this type of shift when we're thinking of form versus function?
Oh, sure. I mean, when you have data at your hands to be able to make decisions in real time based on a behavior, right? If you look at the Twitter stream as you're talking, you're going to change your questions based on what you see the pulse, and so that changes how products are built. Yeah, and it's incredible. I think we've gotten so efficient at a lot of these things, and the cost has basically come down to zero to own. You know, when I first started trying to build a website, cost, you know, tens and tens of thousands of dollars, and now you can do it for free as long as you're willing to suffer through maybe some of the things that come with that. So I think the technology in a lot of these circumstances has gotten to the point where it just allows you to easily follow the trail of what the technology allows you to do. The hard part now is trying to identify how it fits into all the nooks and crannies of how people actually exist, or humans exist, and figure out how to adapt the technology, how to fit what the behaviors of people are. And that is starting to happen, and I think you'll start to see that more and more over the next 10 years, where you don't have to deal with what the technology has given you.
So this plays really well into a question coming from my buddy whose name I can never pronounce. I really apologize. It's Sufyan. He wants to know, what role do analytics and data play in design? So you just mentioned it a little bit, but can you elaborate?
Well, I think analytics is extremely useful when you're trying to gain insights. Insights in a digital world can come at you like left and right, and it's hard to sort of understand what to listen to. The data doesn't lie until you help it lie, and that can be shifted to any perspective you need to validate your perspective. And so what I think is important with data is to keep a healthy sort of a healthy distance from it, because I think in some ways it can distort your ability to understand what the true problem is. So an example, when we work with people on, say, a conversion flow on a shopping cart, you know, they're probably at an A/B testing area where they're trying to determine if we need to move the button there or here or there, change the copy, insert one less form, add a form, which might prevent you from seeing that you may not even need the shopping cart flow altogether, right? And there might be some other solution to have a third party just take care of that transaction for you and not worry about it. Those are the types of things where data can get you lost in the wrong problem, whereas is trying to understand different means to get to the same outcome with perhaps less effort, less costs, less frustration. There's other ways to do this. So I think data is really powerful, but it can also blind you from seeing the true problems.
Yep, I would absolutely agree with that. So a question here from my friend Nancy Rubin. She wants to hear a little bit about whether you think it's good to try to train employees on design thinking or higher up to meet those needs.
I would say that you have no choice. You have to do both. You have to figure out how to do both, because ultimately there's just not enough talent that has these skills ingrained in their skill set. And so I think for us, it's important to train people. Most people are not familiar with that type of thinking and aren't capable of doing it right off the bat. So it takes, in our program, probably about 6 months to a year to get to a place of efficiency. By kind of working with people, I think you bring out the best qualities of them, and they can kind of find themselves in that process. I also think that there is senior leadership that can come in that can basically build confidence in a team that some of these ideas in design thinking aren't irrational, that they are actually grounded in trying to get to successful business outcomes. And so I think there's a case for both of them. I'd say in Silicon Valley, where you're working with tons of smart people around you, sometimes it can be very difficult to find those types of people that are able to do that in your company. So I think you're going to have to be able to train people. And so that's one of our business models is understanding that these challenges, we don't just do work for people, we help train them and help them understand how to do this type of work.
So let's talk a little bit about the training. What are the first steps that you do? Are you assessing people's existing skill set? Are you looking at their mental openness to this? How do you start the design thinking training process? Because it seems have a very strong psychological component.
Yeah, it's repetition. It's just like boot camp in a way. You have to set up objectives and goals for people to start accomplishing things. It's not some warm fuzzy thing where people sit around and try and figure out how to get better at solving problems. You actually have to work on problems. You have to see that there's these problems that exist and there's ways to get to better answers. And so what we do, and a part of our model is that every design leader works with a designer. So projects are two-headed beasts in which both parties are working through a problem together, one taking more of the maybe strategic thinking component and teaching the other how to actually solve these problems through the implementation of them. And so by doing both, you get to learn how to find your own leadership path, but you're also teaching someone how to embrace these methodologies.
So I have a question here from Mehul. Thank you so much, Mehul. He says, what role does good design play in he says all aspects of a new project? So maybe take us from start to finish.
Well, the cool thing about design, it can also be just the opposite. It can screw everything up. So I just want to make sure that design isn't looked upon as the golden egg that solves all the problems. In fact, I was just talking about this, is when people think of design, sometimes they look at it as equal to production. And so we get into situations a lot of times where people are like, yeah, and we need that website that you're going to do, and they haven't really considered like what they want to say, why they want to say it. It's just going to be designed, and somehow design is going to solve this production problem of producing content and actually speaking your mind of what you have to say. So if you look at design, it can work in three spheres. We call them spaces, and as part of our progressive design methodology and design system, there's a lift phase, which is thinking about how you raise the problem and address sort of what the challenge might be. The second space that we play in is a leap, which is framing the challenge. And so framing a challenge means that you're testing out and assessing sort of the potential of an idea or a concept. And the third space that we work in is basically assigning the choices or making decisions based on a direction you get ahead. So in that last stage, landing, that's really production-oriented work where you've got a solid understanding of what the problem is. So in all our projects, we might touch in all three spaces, but some projects might revolve more around, say, a production problem where you need to land and you need to create better templates or structure to a page, and that's much more of a production problem. Whereas if you're trying to figure out how do I get better conversion flow out of these three product areas, that's fairly open-ended, and it doesn't have a solid sort of goal in mind other than to move something 5%, and that still is very vague. So that would be considered a lift type of project. So you can use design in all three realms of both strategic, tactical, and operational projects. And I think if for all those nerds out there that like, say, Peter Drucker, he has a concept called the paradigm of change model, where design works really well to overlapping in those spaces of where design can help a business. So if you're looking at learning more about how design can work in each of those spaces, look up paradigm of change model.
So I have a follow-up question here from Alan Berkson. He wants to know he wants to know if you can discuss the value of cross-disciplinary participation in the design process.
the design process needs cross-disciplinary interaction. That's the only way a great product's going to happen. So look at that. That was a great chug, Bryan. Look at that. That was a good one. The last, very human of you. Where's my sound? Come on. If you're not working with different groups of people, your ideas are going to have a harder time kind of making through the organization. You have to be thinking across different groups. And so just having a CEO or someone strategically say, design is important, we need to listen, you still need to gain influence in that organization with your decision making. And that is about inspiring your teams and teams around you to go for this ride. And so some of that is carrying a feather in one hand and a stick in another, but it means that you have to be working with those groups to understand sort of the vision of an idea. If you're working at, say, what we talked about is the lift phase where it's more strategic, you're going to have to get a lot of C-level people involved in those ideas and making sure that they see it. And that's not always about sitting at boardroom tables and having discussions. It's about trying to get personal calendar time to get those ideas ingrained in people's heads. So if you're not thinking strategically about your relationship building and your web of network, your network in the organization across disciplines, then your projects are going to start seeing failure because you can't push these types of digital products now without integration across the entire business.
So question here from our friend Paul Bradley Smith. He wants to know, how do you organize your time when it comes to design? So maybe we can think of some of your secret sauce.
Secret sauce. So, so an incredibly important concept, while collaboration is really important to the design process, is also very lonely. And I say that because you have to do all of the homework and necessary preparation to show that work in a way that gets the result. So when I might work on a project with someone, there might only be an hour and a half of FaceTime a week, but that hour and a half of FaceTime is incredibly jam-packed with decisions and prep and making sure that that FaceTime is incredibly valuable. So when we think about design, the first rule of thumb I say is you got to do a lot more prep time than most people are used to. Is they've got to put the time and energy. Simply hanging around people won't solve these problems. The second is that I tell designers oftentimes when working on projects where things get really, really hard is write a list. Whether that list is published, whether it's for someone else's, write down your 10 fears. Write down your 10 problem areas. Write down the things that are circling in your head. The brain is awful to us. It works your saboteurs like you'd never believe, and so when you let that mental space be taken up by your saboteurs, your productivity just goes whoo. And when you are dealing in design where you're mainly wrong, remember 2/3 wrong, if you're having to carry all that weight and that baggage, your productivity is worthless. So what I would say is make sure you address the problem areas you can, write them down, talk about your inner fears, and address them in a way that allow you to table it so that you can get to the other problem. The third thing I would say as far as time management is that your brain is also an awesome tool, and that if on a Friday you have a meeting at 2 and you come up with these great ideas and you're able to show them, and whoever you're working with, whether it be a client or stakeholder, says, yes, this, and this, and you're like, yeah. If you don't write that down immediately, you lose opportunity. So I typically tell a designer is that if you have another deliverable on Tuesday of the following week, the clock starts on Friday. Because if you let your brain write down those concepts or ideas, it will work in the background solving these problems for you through the weekend so that when you get into Monday, you're already ready to solve the problems. And most people would say, well, you're working. But that's not really how it works. Is when you love what you're doing, it's sort of this background sort of harmony happening in between what you're doing. It's allowing your brain to synthesize ideas, and you can't do that faster. Like, your brain needs space to be able to synthesize the ideas. So I tell people, commit to those ideas and that feedback right away so that it allows you to kind of marinate. And so that'll give you basically, if you look at 48 hours, 72-hour advantage over the next person that's trying to do the same thing. So how's that? That's 3 things on time management that works around design.
I'd say that that's incredibly powerful. We want to close out with just a question. What's an example of a company or say product that is really doing design right?
That's really doing design right. You know, I feel so superficial saying this, but I don't really have, like, products to me are just sort of the experience that you have using them. If I look at what I like, I love my car because I can get in and go home and I don't have to worry about it. I love my toothbrush because it does just what it needs to and I don't stress about it. What I typically don't like are a lot of new products, to tell you the truth. I'm not always, you know, for a business that runs sort of in the space of new products, I don't really love being a new adopter. It's not very fun for me. So I tend to like products that have been refined over and over and over to reduce sort of the stress of using them on a regular basis. So, you know, using chat now on Google is great. I'm excited about it because it works flawlessly. But I hate putting my face on the camera. I'd rather just do a GoToMeeting where I don't have to show any of my face. So I think I am probably the worst for trying to give you an example of a great product. I think I'm typically in the middle of the bell curve when it comes to wanting to adopt new things. So.
Oh, I love that. I think just the way that you're reasoning it out gives a whole bunch of insight into what you've been talking about, right? Because we're also talking about form and function and, you know, all those little components. So this has been absolutely awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. We had great conversation going on in the background. And Bryan, I am Bryan Kramer. I am turning it over to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Bryan. Bryan, tell us where everybody can find you.
Well, I put up there, I have all my blog posts, chiefinstigator.com. It's a great place to be able to follow me as we start releasing all of these ideas in an open source type of way, so that's the best way to get to them. And of course, our company is Zurb, Z-U-R-B, and you can learn more about our products and services there.
Great. Awesome. And thank you once again. I really appreciate you being here and sharing all your stuff. And Susie just chatted me, and I agree with her that you get extra bonus points for not saying Apple like every other person that comes on here. So, not that we're not Apple fans, but it's always the easy answer. So congrats on that. Let's see. I wanted to just make sure that everybody knew who was up next week. It's going to be Daniel Lemon. He's actually here with me at the conference at Social Media Marketing World. Excellent guy. He wrote a book on reviews, how to get great reviews and how to use the review system. And that goes for reviews on all ends, Amazon reviews, book reviews, every kind of review system that's out there. He did it in a very authentic way. This is all about doing it the right way, not the cheating way. So I hope on Monday you guys will enjoy him. He's going to talk about that, and that'll be at 12 p.m. Pacific Standard Time as well, as it is every week. So thank you once again, everyone, for being here today. Really appreciate it. Bryan, once again, thank you for killing it on H2H Chat. Great information. We'll have the recap up shortly so everybody can see Bryan's smiling face on a recorded video just as he loves it. Okay, so we'll see you guys all next Monday, and we'll talk to you soon. Cheers. Have a great week.